So welcome to the second plenary dialogue. And as Iveta mentioned this morning, we are going to have some surprises, very nice surprises. One of the panelists, Inés Dussel, had a health problem and she's not been able to accompany us. So we are replacing Inés with Dr. David Berliner, and I'm going to facilitate the dialogue. And we are going to have a small change in the format based on the feedback that we obtained this morning. So instead of we start with one question posed by me, the panelists are going to start with a very brief 3-minute statement, and they are going to close with that. And for clarification, some of you mentioned that in the morning there were many acronyms that people didn't know what, and Dr. Benavot very kindly offered to give us a brief translation. So he's going to start commenting on some of the acronyms that were mentioned in the morning, and then we will pass to the opening statements and then with the questions. So we will use the same system of the morning for the questions. You write your question, pass it to Iveta, Iveta organizes those, give it to me, and the panelist answers, okay? So thank you, and we start, Aaron.
Can you hear me? Okay. So yes, it was a bit Chinese this morning, and apparently there's several different acronyms that were not entirely clear. So let me try and do some translation and interpretation. First, there's the SDG that everybody knows about, the Sustainable Development Goals. If you don't, I've got a little symbol here to symbolize the 17 SDGs, holistic, notice it's a circle. There was also mentioned the TCG, the Technical Cooperation Group. This is a continuation of the TAG, Technical Advisory Group, that took place up to the agreement on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and their member state representation, as was mentioned. And this Technical Cooperation Group is meant to examine issues relating to measurement and indicator. So this is kind of in the education sector. At the level of the UN, there is something called the AEAG, the Interagency Expert Group on the SDGs, and it meets in different places, and they're the ones that have determined both the types of global indicators and their measurement. And this works at the level of the SDGs, not at the level of the education sector. The TCG, this Technical Cooperation Group, is something that works within the education sector. And then underneath the TCG is a group that was also mentioned that is organized through UNESCO's Institute for Statistics, is the GAML, which is the GAML, which stands for the Global Alliance for Monitoring Learning. That's met twice so far. And this brings together different people who are interested in learning assessments on the monitoring of learning, and is discussing, as it were, the construction and the processes for maybe developing global metrics around learning. I think those are the main acronyms. Maybe are there some others that I could mention? Sylvia, anyone that I would have, no? I think those are the same. I mean, there's some others that are not really related to learning measurements, so I would think that that's those are the key ones. If you have any other acronyms, then let me know or give it to Iveta, and we'll try to translate those.
Okay. You want to follow with your...
Okay, so now I'm going to do my opening statement. Thank you very much. That was not part of my 3 minutes.
No.
So my name is Aaron Benavot, and I serve as the director of something called the Global Education Monitoring Report. This is a copy. This came out 2 months ago, and the team that I lead and has a mandate from the international education community to prepare a global annual document that looks at progress for the Sustainable Development Goal on Education, SDG 4, and those other SDGs that have an educational component. And this first edition of the GEM report, we previously were known as the Education for All Global Monitoring Report, the EFA GMR, but now we have changed our name and rebranded and so on and so forth. This report, which is quite long, unfortunately, and very heavy. So if you do want a copy, I have a few, but you have to keep in mind that they're going to take up a lot of your excess weight that you might have. It's organized in two parts. One is around the thematic section, which looks at the relationship between education and the other SDGs, and then another part that looks at each of the 10 targets under SDG 4 and discusses all kinds of issues around the monitoring and data around those. So my perspective in coming to this meeting and the perspective that the report has put forward is to look at the issues around the global metric for learning as something underneath several of the targets, not just the target on a global metric for learning under target 4.1 that talks about relevant learning outcomes, but also things to do with adult literacy, with skills for decent work, and also for target 4.7 that talks about acquisition of knowledge and skills for education for sustainable development and global citizenship education. So the different targets under SDG 4 put a big emphasis on learning, and there is, I think, the challenge of developing different ways to compare across different countries for each of these different dimensions, not just in the narrow sense of the foundational skills of literacy and numeracy, or let's say reading and mathematics that were mainly the main focus of the debate, let's say, this morning. Most of what I would have to say is in a set of blogs that are coming out, or that have come out and will come out. Together with the report, we have a blog, it's called the World Education Blog. I would invite you to check it out. Google World Education Blog, UNESCO, or some such thing. And yesterday and today, you will find two pieces that really set out fairly succinctly what the report has to say about global metrics on education. Another one will come out tomorrow. And with that, I have taken up my 3 minutes.
To be a presenter on a moderator, so I need a few notes. My approach to PISA in particular is that it's a standardized achievement test. That's all it is. It has no talismanic properties. It's not going to lead to anything magical. It's just another standardized achievement test. And as such, it has no problems as a standardized achievement test. Despite the panic every year in the USA, there are alternative measures to look at our future. The Global Entrepreneurship Development Index, the U.S. is number 1 2 times in a row, meaning 35-year-olds give a pretty good prediction of the future of the United States. And a 15-year-old American kid who's taking a test that their mother's not going to see, father's not going to see, their teacher's not going to see, and doesn't count for graduation, is going to kiss off the test. So I'll try to use a 35-year-old's entrepreneurial skill as a prediction of the United States than a 15-year-old American kid, because these are Korean kids taking the test for the honor of their country. So the OECD Innovation Index, the U.S. is either 3 or 4 and close to number 1. We have results of PISA, the the percentage of kids who get a 5 or 6 on PISA, the top scores, 33% are in the United States. The OECD is 24%. In math, we have 14.1%, Germany, Canada, France, and UK, and this can go on. So there are alternative metrics for us to worry about in the United States. That's a regular problem with a test, standardized test. We have a language problem. We have research that shows us even though they claim the language is equal, the language can't be held equal. Everybody knows you can't translate from one language to another and get equality. The illustrations have been shown to be biased by different different countries enters into it. The context different countries you do dynamic testing, you find out kids who get PISA items wrong, kids who get PISA items right, double their stuff. So you find out too. The whole point here is that these little differences in the probability of a item at the national level turn out to have huge differences when you impute scores later on. For example, let me give you an example. Ireland had a loss of 13, but PISA scored 519 versus 501. They scored the same. Okay? But once you put the rational into effect and look at how this works out, these tiny little differences due to culture and language are playing out. The U.S. still beat the score 12, but the U.S. got a score of 481, and Slovenia we 36 the same score. Now, depending on your belief in the magic of a Roche model, you either accept these or not. The standards are very large. In other words, there are lots of problems. The poor, the U.S. was 20% oversampled for poor kids in the last one. I'm going to make a prediction. The U.S. is going to look better this time around because they'll probably get the sampling right. I don't think we've improved necessarily, but if the sample is right, it'll be different. My point is, all we need to do is stop treating PISA as magical like the newspapers do, and start treating it like any other standardized achievement test, which has enormous problems and is usually subject to social class issues in the scores. Anyway, I can elaborate on every point, but that's enough.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monisha Bajaj, and I'm an associate professor at the University of San Francisco. And the majority of the last 2 decades of my life have been in developing programs, developing curricula, and doing research on human rights education. What is human rights education? Very simply, teaching and learning about human rights. And a lot of research takes place in India, in Zambia, in the Dominican Republic, here in the U.S., and then looking at global movements towards human rights education as well. Most recently, I was part of a team of 3 researchers. We prepared an annex report to the Global Citizenship Commission's report that assesses the nearly 70 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the United Nations. And we a 120-page annex that was launched with the report was led and chaired by Gordon Brown, the former UK Prime Minister, and the UN Special Envoy for Global Education. And we argue that with human rights education is the cornerstone of the achievement of all other human rights. And so what's interesting, this opening statement I was reminded of, was in thinking about what learning metrics assess and what are the kind of more holistic purposes of education. Most of the research I do, I never use the word metric, I never really look at the learning metrics. It's very difficult to measure the outcomes of human rights education, of citizenship education, of peace education through these very standardized measures. And I'm pleased that the SDGs have now included more language around global citizenship. It just makes it very difficult in terms of some of the questions I pose in my statement. How do we measure agency? How do we compare empathy? How do we evaluate dignity? How do we really assess these things that we want students to come out of schooling systems with? But oftentimes, as Inés says in her statement, she's not here, but her statement is up on the web, that often what we're measuring ends up being what is forced into school systems, into textbooks, and what the focus of the learning is. So how do we expect to develop these larger capacities, these larger important social goods in students when we're not focusing on them through any type of, and I don't know that they can be measured. It's very difficult to measure these things, and perhaps that's why they don't make it into many of the global conversations. In the discussions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the world was coming out of World War II. The 26 of the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was for basic, free, compulsory education that state governments would provide. And number 2, which says that education should be directed to the development of personalities, promotion of fundamental freedoms. Basically, all education should be directed to the promotion of human rights. And that came out of the experience of the Holocaust, where very educated individuals were in charge of doing medical experiments on individuals. There were horrific things that we've seen when education doesn't have a moral orientation towards the social good. So how do we capture that? How do we promote that such that metrics don't reduce learning to just what's on the test? Because I think what happens is that very educated individuals who don't have these basic components of what we would consider a good citizen or even a good human being.
So as in the morning, we have now 2 minutes to engage with each other's comments.
So I'm really appreciative of what Monisha kind of presented here, because the link between the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Target 4.7 is extremely connected. And so the fact that the international community, 70 years on, has finally come back and revisited for the first time the content of education kind of as a priority, to see, as it were, issues to do with, values, mores, moral education, or these broader aims and purposes of education beyond the instrumental, that are much more speaking to humanistic issues, to things that are involved not just in terms of skills for the labor market, but who we are as people, what kinds of communities, and the extent to which we develop the capacities to live sustainable lives in a very different kind of a world. And so certainly this is part of the vision, and that's why Target 4.7 has been incorporated. And for many people in the SDG business, Target 4.7 is the most relevant education target of all the targets, because it links specifically with each of the other purposes, the broader kind of issues here. So I think it's enormously important to keep that in mind. So yes, the technical challenges of trying to develop, as it were, an instrument to, and by the way, 4.7 does not only talk about students in school, but it talks about all learners, regardless of age. So the emphasis is on adults, adolescents, and children, and the extent to which they develop these capacities in this area, in these areas that are a little bit off the usual rubric that we think of about a standardized learning achievement test. So, and in many ways, the history needs to be written of how this came together. I think that has yet to be done. But I think that one of the things that we as a kind of a comparative education community needs to consider is how do we go forward in developing, as it were, some of the technical capacities for trying to measure learning outcomes that are not the traditional ones, that have been legitimated in this new agenda, that are certainly very nuanced and speak to all the problems about contextualization and the difficulty of going, how do you deal with citizenship or global citizenship, what it means, from one country to another, or even the notion of human rights. I'm sure you could speak to that too. But regardless of the challenge, I think that we really need to offer over the course of the next couple of years, what would be the steps that would need to be taken to explore and pilot a kind of a set of instruments to start looking at some of these issues that I think are enormously important within the new agenda, beyond the literacy, numeracy, which are certainly fundamental skills or foundational skills, but are also have been prioritized in the new agenda.
If I may, you used the term instrument a couple of times, and you used the term metric a couple of times. And for the kinds of outcomes I think you're talking about, you may be misguided. We run a jury system in the United States. It's not perfect, but nobody talks of instruments or metrics. We kill people or release them back on the streets by competent citizens making very complex judgments. So it's obviously done literally for life and death. And again, the idea of wanting metrics on whether people are good citizens or not, or whether they're getting the right educational programs or not, or whether they have humanistic feelings to the other, or whether they have benevolence toward their fellow men and women, maybe we go down a path that's not going to lead us anywhere if we want to instrument it and we want metrics. And maybe we need to find ways to have more human judgment about these things, and panels that interview kids, and panels that visit schools and look at curriculum. And I suppose you can give it a number or give it a, or something, but fundamentally, I don't think we want to talk too much about metrics and instruments. I think we want to talk about ways to judge curriculum and the classroom lives on the issues we are concerned about. So.
I tend to agree. I tend to agree on one hand that yes, it's very difficult to measure these things, and do we really need to, and are we wasting a lot of energy focusing on finding the right metric rather than just doing the work and figuring out, like what are the things that build these types of capacities within students, within adolescents, within young adults, that help them lead more kind of fulfilled lives, or at the same time, as someone mentioned in the panel before, in the Q&A, that are allowing for this kind of, decontextualization where you have social class reproduce and poor resources, and there's no sort of basic standard that's being implemented to really ensure the rest of this discussion of global metrics and standardization and No Child Left Behind in the United States has meant donor funding and state funding being infused into education and schooling, because there is this goal of performing better and reaching these certain standards. And so this discourse has to, in some cases, for innovative things to happen with the aims of, and sometimes it's very subversive. People will put a program but tie it to, one of these standardized norms in some way that we are going to improve attendance, but really what we're going to do is also really creative programming. So that's sort of the skeptic's argument about, well, maybe there does need to be some norms because people can subvert them and use them towards their ends. But then at the same time, we have schools that don't have PE, physical education, don't have arts, don't have anything except what's going to be examined on the test. So you completely reduce, and what's that famous quote, is that Mark Twain, who says, don't let schooling get in the way of your education. It's also metrics get in the way of learning, and kind of holistic education in that same way.
The things are countable, they're easy, you can develop an easy metric for that. I was talking about the human rights issues, the respect for others issues, those are the kinds of things that are very hard to measure in your report and your comments.
Yeah.
Measure on
subversion. So there was an organization that I did some work with when I was in New York that got a huge attendance improvement grant from the city of New York. And what they used that grant for was teaching global citizenship education in schools. So they targeted material from the students who were coming, but they snuck in through the back door the human rights, the peace education, the citizenship. So there's an opening when there's money made available, and some of this discourse allows for that. But I agree with you completely that we aren't focusing on perhaps those things.
David, you'd be kind of pleased to find out that the global indicator that they use, that has been put forward for Target 4.7, is precisely to say, in the absence of a scale, what we do need to collect information on is the extent to which education for sustainable development and global citizenship education are mainstreamed in teacher preparation, in curricula, in student assessments, and in, I forget the fourth one now. And in fact, that's the way we went about our monitoring. So we did try to compile as much evidence as we possibly could, together with the International Bureau of Education in Geneva, of national curricular documents and the extent to which they place any emphasis on these kind of topics or themes. And you see pretty substantive cross-national differences in this regard. It's much more difficult to figure out how to do this in terms of teacher education, whether it be pre-service or in-service, because many countries have multiple channels through which teachers become qualified, and it's difficult to figure out exactly where would you go to identify the extent to which these issues are given priority or not. And in terms of student assessment, it's mainly looking at the national assessment, the idea being, and here you'd be surprised maybe to find out that there are quite a few countries around the world. These are not part of regional or international assessment platforms, but at the national level, they have prioritized learning in these areas and have developed very particular kinds of metrics that are meaningful in that country for these particular issues, and those can be identified also through various kinds of pools. The idea being behind this kind of global indicator that the more a student is exposed to, the greater teachers have been taught in and they're assessed on these issues, the greater, the greater they would acquire the knowledge and skills that would be favorable to them doing well if we did have an instrument. But the idea about the longer impact of these things, and I think this is an issue that goes also to reading and literacy to the same extent that it would for global citizenship and some of the other issues, it's not entirely clear to me, and partly because of the absence of a lot of longitudinal evidence, that those students who do well in some of these areas as when they're young, let's say at the primary level or the secondary level, would necessarily test the same or at the same levels if you went 10 years later, 20 years later, when they move into the adult world. And this, I think, is a kind of a contradiction that I think Eric Hanishek maybe missed a little bit in his point about the MDGs having failed to really affect learning outcomes. First of all, it wasn't really the agenda to try to affect learning, but we have this kind of contradiction that even when kids do poorly in school, when you look at adults and you compare the levels of education around a whole series of different attitudes and behavioral outcomes, there are enormous educational differences, regardless of the kind of quality of school that they have attained. So there are big differences between those that have a secondary or a primary or who are illiterate or have never been to school. So there's this kind of strange contradiction that even if they, quote unquote, haven't learned very much that we've tested, the fact that they've been to school and they go on in adult life, they acquire all kinds of attitudes and dispositions that are different from those that haven't been to school or that have been to school less.
I'm going to try to bring some of the questions from the audience. So at least three of the questions point to the same issue of recognizing that assessing non-cognitive skills, emotional skills, citizenship is very, very difficult. Recognizing that, how much coordination, how much efforts do you see are there in terms of trying to assess those elements, and how much efforts would you like to see in that area vis-a-vis the more traditional assessments of language skills and math?
Should I start? I guess I'll respond a little bit to what was just said and then also answer that question, is that I think sometimes when we just look at national policy that oftentimes incorporates scholarly language, what's popular in international discourse, there's not a lot of teeth on the ground. So my research in India looked at human rights education at the levels of policy and then regional textbook development and then on the ground through practice, through NGOs that were working in schools. And I found incorporated human rights issues at the national level and the teacher education framework and the, in different frameworks for student learning and through the National Human Rights Commission. But when I would get down to schools, no one had really ever heard of these things. They would skip chapters in the textbook that talked about things because they weren't on the test. You would see, children being beaten if they couldn't, answer a math test or question that was going to be on the test, even though corporal punishment was illegal. There was kind of a commonly held belief that if students weren't beaten, they wouldn't be scared enough to study things that were hard, so they wouldn't persist at it. And in schools that were in rural areas, students of the lowest caste would be seated in the back, higher caste would be seated in the front because, they were the students of higher caste would be seen as more, more intelligent and more worthy of the instruction. So I'm not sure that policy always translates into practice. It does provide an opening for local groups to get funded and perhaps do some work that's more substantive at the ground level if the international discourse gives them those kinds of things to put their hooks into and then develop in more meaningful ways. But I'm a little skeptical of the policy, national government self-reported policies on these types of things. And then the question was, how important is it to assess? I'm not sure. I do think it's important to think about learning cross-nationally, learning from different examples. I'm not sure the assessment is the way to go about it. So I think there can be examples and principles that we highlight through really in-depth case studies of what works in different contexts, and there can be cross-learning that happens across them. I'm really kind of thinking about the different models of learning that have happened from organizations that have had success. The big NGO in Bangladesh has a very innovative way of teaching others about what it does and people coming and learning about their model. TOSTA is another great non-governmental organization in West Africa. Rights education. They've just built a huge training center for people to learn about their model. Escuela Nueva in Colombia does that. They're having an international congress this week to learn about models. So I think some of that cross-learning can happen, which would to me be the point of cross-national comparison, would be to learn and not necessarily cognitively, but to kind of get inspired and figure out how to implement. I'm not sure we would learn from an international metric on human rights education, because I don't know how accurate it would be beyond the cognitive, beyond when was the UDHL passed by the UN and in what year was the UN created. Student really knowing about it, does that make them sort of display the affective, the attitudinal, the values-based, the action-oriented skills that are kind of the more holistic vision of human rights education? I don't know that it does, and I'm not sure that we can capture that in any way, so I don't know that it's useful.
She said what I would say.
I have to pick up from there. I would say that the challenges of looking at and assessing learning in these areas are probably not all that different in principle to looking at learning in the more conventional areas. So, I mean, if you were to go back maybe 30 or 40 years before the IEA was established in whenever it was, 1959 or 66, IEA, the International Association for the Advancement of Educational Achievement, that did the first, I don't know what it was. It wasn't called TIMS back then. It was called FIMS and SIMS and all kinds of other different things. At that point, cross-national, and it was only after you got a bunch of researchers who got together. I think at the beginning it was, researchers who represented about 12 countries who came together and said, okay, what do your 8th grade students learn in mathematics? And show me the textbook that is used in your country. And they begin to kind of compare the domain, the general domain, the subdomains of mathematics, and they tried to see where there are commonalities. And then in each of those subdomains there were commonalities. They developed items around those, and then they developed a test that allowed them to say, this is the level of achievement of the students in 8th grade mathematics. You can do the same analysis for global citizenship. You can do the same thing around civics. I mean, in some sense, the way you would to look at it would be get the experts or the people who are working in this area in many different countries to compare the kinds of instructional materials, textbooks, official curriculum, and to see, is there any shared content? And is it only minimal, in terms of do they know when the UN was established? Or are there other areas that you could see as commonalities and you could begin to build tests? And the fact of the matter is, there are regions or small regions or groups of countries today that are doing precisely that are getting together and beginning to come up with pilot projects for looking at areas around sustainability and around global citizenship, sometimes tied in with their civics and social studies more generally. So I wouldn't start from the assumption that somehow there's something distinctive or unique about language skills or mathematics. People do make the argument that mathematics is a more structured system of knowledge, and therefore the progression of, let's say, proficiency in mathematics would look different from, let's say, the progression of proficiency in language. But I think that, if we think of the domain as somehow this holistic domain, that it has cognitive items and non-cognitive items, the affective and the behavioral are also going to appear in these other domains. So I think that the challenge is out there for us to, take it seriously. Certainly at the level of what is in the textbooks and what are in the official syllabi, there's a lot of coding schemes that are now being developed. Not a lot, but there's a few that are being used in order to identify the extent to which these issues, these themes, these topics are being integrated in the kind of official intended instructional materials for students at different levels.
Yeah, I just want to say that, the testing of knowledge and skills can get better and better and better. We have technology for it. We're very good at it. The testing of dispositions has always been more problematic. And when you're in the areas you're talking about, human rights and dispositions toward the other and these sorts of things, we just don't have the technology. Which means that the systems for making judgments about them, I don't think we give up trying to make judgments, but the systems for making judgments about whether nations are doing good things or not, that's going to be much less reliable, valid, much more human-based, much more judgmental, and I don't think I know a way to escape that right now.
So, this morning, one colleague says, I have to run, I have another meeting with teachers in the Valley. And I says, one of the teachers I know, says, it's like, if they ask me what type of meeting is this, what do you think I should answer? Why the teachers and the principals and the students in the Valley should care about these topics? I thought that was a valid question, particularly because we are talking about the feasibility of this global learning metric. So what should I tell my friend, the teacher in the Valley? And then I have one about Brazil, just in case, so don't worry.
I start? Tell me a little bit about the Valley. What is that? Like here? Okay. What's the general educational, what's your assessment of the educational level of the Valley? No, just out of curiosity. Yeah, I mean, what would you tell a group of teachers and principals who are in it every day that we are doing here? I mean, I guess the question is, like, the way that these schools would be considered kind of underperforming or low performing are based on some sort of rank or assessment of what is quality education or what students should be focusing on. I guess the answer by saying, well, we're putting these up for discussion, we're taking a step back and saying what matters, and I think the way that you phrase some of the questions for openings of people like me who don't really use metrics or really necessarily efficacy to come in and be part of the conversation. So I think that could be very hopeful for schools that are beholden to certain norms and standards to say, well, maybe there's other things that can come into how you get students interested, get them engaged, and something that I think has been a really unfortunate and almost devastating side of this rise in at least national in this country, but globally, is the reduction in arts-based programs, in physical education, and different ways of learning, that students don't just come in and learn one way of math or one way of language arts or one way of science and get it. There are other things that provide for different points of entry to get students interested in school and get them engaged. And I think those have been reduced. There's one way of learning that's been sort of valorized and prioritized, and students who don't perform in that way or don't learn in that way are considered failures, or they're going to affect their teachers' salaries if they don't perform well on the test, or there have been these subtle movements to get them to be absent on the days that tests happen so that school funding doesn't decrease, or they've been made to feel unwelcome in their own schools and their own educative institutions, that where they're supposed to belong, that are supposed to be centers of the community, where people feel included and where they're supposed to belong. And if you don't learn in one particular way, you're made to feel completely outside of that something's wrong with you. And the psychological effect of that too, I think, is really worrisome. So I would tell them that we are reconsidering these at the global level, of what it means for school systems everywhere, what it means to be underperforming, or what we should focus on, and what really matters for students and their families.
I would basically say the question is relevant to any meeting of the Comparative International Education Society. So, CIES is a little bit of a, let's say, esoteric group in the eyes and minds of most educators here in the U.S., partly because anything international is considered, a little bit problematic. Globalization has an impact on their lives, but the extent to which international dimensions are incorporated. I mean, I don't speak as somebody who spent as much time in the schools, whether it be here in Arizona or a little bit in upstate New York where I serve as a professor when I'm not working at UNESCO. But the fact of the matter is that, most American schools don't find a way to incorporate a lot of knowledge and information about education in other parts of the world. So I think that the challenge for comparative educators, whether it be in a symposium like this or more generally, is to try to impress upon principals and teachers why it is in their interest to know more about education systems in other parts of the world. And when I teach, I often say to many of the graduate students that I come into contact with who are, let's say, superintendents or principals or teachers, that in most cases they teach in schools where the student body is enormously diverse, where they have students who are either first generation, second generation children of migrants or immigrants. And partly if you want to be an effective teacher and to be able to have a kind of to improve in the ways in which you come into contact with the students in your classroom, it's worthwhile knowing a little bit more about the culture from whence the students or their parents come from. And education is often a kind of a platform, a window, an eye into the cultures around the world. So I think that schools are, in some sense, can become more effective, or they become enriched, they are higher quality, and teachers teach in better ways when they learn about the world of education outside of the United States. So that when they use the term comparative education, it isn't what's going on in New Mexico or Colorado, but rather what's going on in Canada and other parts, or Mexico and other parts of the world. I think it adds a kind of a richness to the conversation. At least I have found that in my classes. So that would be the way that I would want to engage on that. Provide an answer.
I'm surprised at both answers. I would say the defense of reading here is the same defense for why you study Chaucer or the Elizabethan sonnets. It's a part of the humanities. It's a part of the enrichment of the human experience that we use in your group. I'm not a member of it, but I feel a part of it with social science methods, humanities methods. We have values about the way the world might be a little bit better. I think, I don't know of a single person here who's here to make the world worse. We're probably here to make the world better. And so we're part of the humanities in a way. And the humanities have to be defended on faith. Otherwise, we'd have nothing but engineering schools. I didn't say there was anything wrong with engineering schools. The university has particularly lasted by its commitment to values of the humanities, and the professional schools like engineering or computer sciences, they got it wrong, okay? We come from a tradition of valuing knowledge for the sake of knowledge and for the values that go with that, and it seems to me that's a good defense of what everybody here does.
That note, one of the questions is, how do you propose that peace education, human rights, and citizenship can be measured? For example, if we do a regional study of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, those concepts will be interpreted very differently in each country. So is that possible?
I don't know that it is, and I don't know that it's useful. But I mean, I'm hopeful to what Aaron says about the history of the TIMSS and the PISA tests, that they didn't have constructs that were comparable, and that they were able to come up with them. Because what I think has happened sort of, 30, 40 years on, is that you have tremendous amount of public interest in how to perform on these tests. Every time the tests come out in India or in the US, there's all these, articles about it, and what does it mean, and where do we put energy, and where it's funded, and where's focus. So if there were some sort of international stake in what it means to be considered low or high on these measures, it could galvanize funding, it could galvanize political will towards these tested outcomes. So I do think it could be useful. I'm not sure how we would even begin to measure that beyond these very basic and, to me, meaningless, points of when the UN was created and, what is the CEDAW Declaration about, ending violence against women say, just very kind of regurgitating what's been said by the UN. If there's something that could get beyond that kind of basic information, I think it would be useful I see a value in it. I just don't see how we even get there to some sort of cross-national something that, addresses these types of issues. Because, it's understood very differently. Peace defined in the countries that were mentioned there as opposed to any other country is going to be understood completely differently. Human rights groups are viewed very differently around the world. And in some cases, people don't like to talk about human rights because they're defending criminals or they're defending people who are considered pariahs in that society. And so there's a very different understanding of what those terms mean, who they're associated with socially, which is very different than math or other, subjects that don't have those types of,
I agree and disagree. I actually think there's a lot of contextualization of knowledge in the area of mathematics and reading and writing that often is buffered or kind of bracketed in order to concentrate on what seems to be comparable. And I think it raises a very important issue that was touched upon a little bit this morning, but maybe I'll bring it again. If the overall purpose of assessment is essentially to provide a platform to engage lots of different educational stakeholders from the local level, to regional and national levels in the improvement and the provision of good quality education in schools, then the question becomes, is this really something that you can see a link between a broader metric or a global metric and, the kind of improvement that I think we are concerned about? So I could imagine that countries in all the different subject areas develop, various kinds of assessment frameworks, and they look for change over time. In other words, they pay attention to the extent to which they can look at trend data. And for that country, especially if they gather information about characteristics of schools, which, by the way, is often not available in global metrics, or characteristics of a wide range of aspects of the individual student, which is also important, that with this more nuanced data, they can really target those groups or those schools that need to be targeted in order to deal with issues of equity and whatnot. And that by having a robust, high-quality assessment strategy at the national level, in my view, can be as impactful and as important to bring about the kind of improvements that we would like to see than necessarily spending a lot of time and effort in creating a global metric. I think that you can, if more countries were to engage in that kind of activity and then begin to have conversations, let's say first and foremost at the regional level, where often there's a shared culture, even a shared language, then it makes a lot of sense to then begin to think of it as an emergent property at the regional and maybe eventually at the global level. So I see the global metric, and here maybe I take issue a little bit with Karen Mundy. I would not start with a global metric as a means to improve national assessment systems. I would try to intervene at the earliest possible stage at trying to improve the capacities of countries, especially low-resource countries, in improving their assessment frameworks, and then from there begin to build up through various kinds of conversations and through consensus building about definitions, about subdomains, about the kinds of items that are considered to be, more culturally sensitive and less culturally sensitive, and slowly but surely we maybe emerge with some kind of global metric at the end of the 15-year period. Now I should bracket this to say Aaron Benavot is a comparative education researcher and not so much Aaron Benavot as the director of the GEM report, because I have very different kinds of responsibilities and commitments here. But since I'm going back to academia, you'll allow me the privilege to kind of think about what my position would be after I leave my current focus.
My other question related to this is, Could you discuss the benefits and risks of standardizing a measure for reading in relationship to what we are discussing?
A measure for reading?
Yes.
I'll pass on that. Maybe you can come back to me.
I'm not sure of the intent of the question. The idea of a pretty good metric in some area is to help you decide on policy. If you've got a pretty good metric, you might be able to think about what you do about the score that you got and how you got it and why you got that score. I should think reading or math or a bunch of areas fall into that category. And I might say that if you don't have a pretty good metric, that the one that leads well to policy, which I believe PISA is like that, it's not a great metric for policy, it is a good metric for leading to conversations. So why did we get that score? How did we get that score? It's not got the greatest reliability, it's got a big standard error, it's sampling got problems, but if it has enough reliability in a metric to take seriously, if it has a sense of validity to take seriously, then it's a perfect example of why you should have a conversation. You shouldn't jump to policy, you should have conversations. And you probably ought to have the same metric over time, because any one shot of these things is probably going to mislead you. So you need a couple of years or a couple of and to hold conversations, particularly at the national level. What does it mean that you can read prose documents very well, but scientific documents very poorly? Okay. That's what the metric was telling us. Well, why might that be the case? What should we do about it? Let's see if it happens in the next iteration of the metric. So I think I'm not anti-testing, I'm not anti-assessment, I'm just anti-making policy too quickly from these metrics that we use, particularly the international ones. I think they really generate good conversations by knowledgeable people. And that's what I put a period right there. That's what they're for.
So I would ask us to consider a couple different things here. One, we report in the GEM report that based on work that some of the colleagues in our association have carried out, that something in the range of about 1/3 to 40% of young people who enter primary school enter a school in which the language of instruction is not a language that they were taught at home. And so developing, reading assessments at grades 2 and 3, and even at the end of primary education, for students that need, as it were, a considerable amount of time to transition from begins to then quite a bit would make. And certainly in many of the countries around the world that are multilingual, in which there's a lot of contestation about the languages of instruction, especially the extent to which they link with colonial pasts and other kinds of issues. These are really important issues. And so to somehow see reading as decontextualized from the home environments and the political environments in which languages get constructed, I think is highly problematic. The argument that usually is put forward of why you want to assess reading is because usually there's a fairly high association between, let's say, performance in reading and performance in other kinds of areas. So that's often the argument I hear from Andreas Schleicher, why we don't really need an assessment in, let's say, environmental education, because basically we can show you that if, kids do well in reading, in mathematics or in science, it essentially is highly correlated. But the fact of the matter is that it depends a lot on what you assess and which subject areas you assess. So I do not think at least in the absence of evidence that would support this, that all the other subject areas that we would consider to be, let's say, in the humanities and in other areas that we are talking about, like human rights and other kinds kinds of issues, it is not necessarily the case that high levels of achievement in reading would be associated with high levels of, let's say, testing in some of these other areas. So that would also mean that the policies that we would want to develop, especially if we're trying to reduce inequalities and address issues of equity, they would have to be much more nuanced, because there are one set of schools or one set of students that we would identify as being highly underachievers based only on reading, that would look different if we had multiple kind of instruments or multiple assessments, that we would have a much more nuanced and kind of variegated picture about achievements in a school along many different dimensions and not just a single dimension like reading.
Yeah, just a comment on the richness of a conversation. Arizona passed a law a number of years ago that was very harsh on Hispanics, and lots of them left the state. Simultaneously, our state test scores went straight up. Okay? So the legislature was so pleased. They've been cutting the funding for education, but the scores are going up. And that's magic, and how wonderful our teachers are, our schools, our curriculum, our tests. And of course, some colleagues of mine at Arizona State University showed that as the percentage of English language learners went down, the scores on the state reading exam went up. It's exactly what you expect. Unless you engage in the richness of a conversation with lots of people with skills to add to the conversation, you're just going to get the political side of it, which is that the scores went up. They didn't, okay? Well, they did, but they went up for another reason, and it had nothing to do with the quality of instruction or curriculum. So the data do not speak for themselves. That's really my point, okay? They speak to us, and we have to interpret it.
So talking about the interpretation of the data, these last 2 or 3 weeks, well, actually a little bit longer, but the schools in Brazil, high schools in Brazil, and federal universities are starting to mobilize and to occupy the schools, basically. And federal universities are calling for a strike to prevent a change in the budget and in a law that will put caps on the budget. And so I was in one of the high schools, and a dialogue between a principal, teachers, and the students that didn't let the principals or the teachers to get into the schools. And because I don't get paid by the state, I go in because I'm not breaking the picket line. So, and the dialogue was about this, the principals and the teachers saying, we have to do something in the school. We have to learn, take advantage of this situation, and let's try to continue learning. Let's do something outside the curriculum, but we need to continue learning. The kids saying, no, because this is a strike. We are occupying the school. No. And the argument continued with, but we are going to go down in the metrics, in the score. The school is going to be ranked lower, and the whole country is looking for us to go up, and we are. So what do you see as these uses? It's not that the people that produce the global learning metrics are using it in that way, but it seems that that's the most common use in many countries. So, suggestions. What's our responsibility with regards to that?
Again, one of our colleagues here talked about assessment literacy, and it seems to me that every society needs a big dose of assessment literacy in understanding what the scores mean, how they're computed, how they can be raised up or lowered, and how to interpret from that standpoint so you can have intelligent conversations. But assessment literacy is noticeably lacking in most teacher ed programs. Assessment literacy is lacking on the international communities for journalists. We got a real problem with, since we've become a measure of or metrification has taken such a hold on all our societies, we need education in the interpretation of those metrics, and we don't have it. And it seems to me if I could wave a wand, I would make sure every teacher and every administrator, every school of ed person, and every journalist had more assessment literacy, so you wouldn't get these kind of crazy comments about what we need to do to get scores up or down.
Can I jump in? I mean, I guess I can assume where this came from, but I'm not exactly sure where the complete focus on the individual came from in these types of accountability measures. Why is the unit of analysis not the school in terms of collectively understanding, like, you know, what the school is doing and how many students in the school are engaged in their communities, or how many teachers visit their children's homes, and, you know, measures that have something to do with the collective, and that there would be some sort of. And Leslie Bartlett and I just finished an article looking at the Internationals Network for Public Schools here in the U.S. that is a schooling model. It's about 25, 30 schools for newly arrived immigrant and refugee youth, and something that they do very well is heterogeneous grouping. And the reason why it works is because students are helping each other, they're mixed age, mixed grade, but there isn't that focus on, you know, the individual is bought into the collective success. And if we created that, then the whole entire school would be working together to bring everyone up, rather than these kind of atomized individual scores going back into some database that decides whether your teacher is going to be fired or not paid, or, you know, whether the school is going to lose some funding or be ranked lower. That it creates this kind of incentive mechanism for things that often are run counter to what we see as valuable in education. So I know this individualized metric, you know, that it has to be individual student scores, and then you see this huge opt-out movement in the U.S. and in other places where people don't even buy into that or even want to be part of that. It tends to be the kids who may do better and bring the scores up. So principals are very scared when the parents opt out, because what does that mean for their ranking or for their funding? So I wonder why we have gotten caught on the individual rather than looking at schools as units of analysis.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And also from the point of view of the evidentiary base, certainly in these areas that we've been discussing, you know, outside of reading and mathematics, global citizenship and education for sustainable development, the evidence would be quite clear that this whole school approach is probably the most powerful means of changing the hearts and minds of young people in these areas. And a whole school approach would be one in which, you know, the principal or school leadership, teachers, are all involved in one way or another, including both in formal curricular activities and extracurricular activities, that the school has gardens, that they are engaged with the community, that there's all kinds of experiences with nature. In other words, it goes on and on, but it's really part of the design of the school, the way the school understands itself, the kind of identity that it creates, and certainly the kinds of assessment platforms that we currently have available really don't give us a way to kind of identify those schools that have kind of taken this as a way of you know, developing a more collective sense of pedagogy and purpose. And again, based on the data, it seems to be quite strong, the impact on some of the learning outcomes that we're concerned about.
Can I chime in one thing real quick? I'm reminded of, it's not a metric, but it's a network, the Human Rights Friendly Schools Network of Amnesty International, and schools sign on to this, and it has 4 different areas of, you know, related to school design and pedagogy and practices and school discipline, and then more content related and more affective and action. So it is a type of measure. There's no punitive nature to it, that schools can kind of opt into it, and it becomes sort of an aspirational measure that you don't have to be perfect to get into the network, but then you're in conversation with schools around the world and you try to learn and build from each other. To me, that's a more valuable sort of system of really getting at issues like human rights and citizenship, sustainability, than these types of punitive, individualized metrics.
Just an anecdote at this late hour. Jane Stallings, who ultimately was the president of the American Educational Research Association, early in her career was giving a standardized test up on the Navajo reservation. And she did all the usual things, you know, I'll tell you when to pick up your pencils, I'll time it, here's what you're going to do, and kids all were about 5th graders, the kids all seem to know, and she says, ready, begin, and she puts the stopwatch on, and the kids open the booklets and they start, and a minute or two later, one kid gets up and walks over to another kid, and she says, no, you have to sit down, you have to do it by yourself. And the little girl says, why? If he knows the answer, I don't need to. So that's the sense of collective. And in the national culture, it is very strong. And we have an individualistic notion, and that's not always appropriate.
I'm going to ask one question that is a composite of 2 or 3, and then you will have the time to your finals. This conversation points to the limitations of the very concept of learning itself. Maybe this is a dangerous narrowing of what we understand education to be. Are we reducing education to an economic transaction? In a learning world, do we undermine the possibilities of democratic deliberations about the purpose of education and its place in the world? And so, considering that education and learning is part of a complex network of interactions and dynamics where families and schools and other institutions intervene, shouldn't we be expanding this conversation?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, something that I'm a doctoral student looking at now is museums as sites of human rights education and learning, and, comparing how pedagogical processes and practices happen there, and what does that mean for someone who goes with their family as opposed to their school and takes in information. The student is looking at the Canadian Human Rights Museum that focuses a lot on Indigenous heritage and that past, and presenting examples. And I couldn't agree more. I think, we've reduced education to school. We've reduced learning to these metrics that someone decides are important. And what we're doing is we're limiting kind of the whole range of possibilities of what it means to really be educated in informal, in non-formal, informal spaces, because the only thing that really matters for your future, for your tests, for what you can go on to, for your school's funding, is some score that is taken in abstraction from the whole larger kind of ecology of what education in its broadest sense is about. So I do think that, when we narrow what is counted, we narrow what students are going to be able to look to for their own fulfillment and their own actualization. It's back to the question of the instrumental kind of approaches versus the more kind of intrinsic and inherent self-actualization, what you were saying about the humanities. There is this kind of larger purpose of education as it was conceived, and we don't focus on that. There are even space for that to be focused on when we only count certain things, and the counting of that isn't just purely informational, it's punitive, and it's, it relates to the actual funding you will receive, the teachers that you will have.
I find the question disturbing. It's like saying we shouldn't have feedback systems to get better at what we do. Well, of course we need feedback systems. Figuring out what those systems are is our problem. If you're a business, do you want customer satisfaction or profits? Maybe both. Okay, you have feedback to improve your system. The movement toward metrification may have overdone it, but the fact of the matter is, if you get a good metric, you've got a wonderful thing. If you can measure customer satisfaction, your business will be enhanced. If you can measure student learning in reading or science, your system will be enhanced. So let's not throw out the concept of collecting data to improve our systems. Let's try to find the methods to do that work for the particular thing we're measuring, like some form of human caring versus some form of knowledge of some science concept. We have to pick the metrics or the feedback systems that are appropriate to the things we want to measure. But to get rid of them, to not measure learning, this strikes me as silly.
So my concern is the unintended consequences of having a metric or mobilizing a lot of collective effort toward developing a metric that is narrowly construed in a very small range of capabilities and learning outcomes that is currently being discussed, and that we discussed in the morning, and some of the discussions that are ongoing. It does, in my view, impoverish the way we understand learning and that learning actually takes place. And furthermore, most of the assessments that we've been discussing are school-based assessments. And for many parts of the world, there are large swaths of young people who are not in school, who have left school, who cannot attend school for all kinds of different reasons. And so whatever feedback mechanisms we are, the agenda, at least from the international point of view, is leaving no one behind, regardless of their school status. So we need to also develop feedback mechanisms that speak to the concerns of those children and adolescents who are not in school, and to assess learning that goes on, that obviously they are also learning. And in many of the issues, we have a very difficult time of discerning what is the real value added of attending school versus the impact of family, community, extended family, which is also, we know, in many of these areas, enormous, if not even more important than what goes on in school. So I think that my concern again is the unintended consequences of the efforts that are being made that are often focused on a very narrow range of foundational skills. Yes, they are valuable. Yes, they are important. Yes, they may be associated with some other outcomes. But if that's the only things that we work on in the next 15 years and get right, then we will have done, in my view, ourselves and the international community a big disservice.
It's a question about PISA, but I'm changing it to global learning metrics. Mm-hmm. So, do global learning metrics have any benefit for the United States? Can the United States learn anything from those? For example, the divide between urban and rural students, differences between the regions. And can you, this is for Dr. Berliner, why Canada does better than the USA in those global learning metrics?
Well, can we learn anything useful from them? The answer is yes. I learned from Finland, for example, of your kids in poverty instead of 22% of your kids in poverty. Probably makes a difference on your scores. That's one reasonable explanation for differences. I've learned from Pasi Selberg's work, he's here somewhere, about as you drift toward a more equal society, it looks like you do better in schooling. Well, that's a fascinating finding that should impress at least some politicians, certainly won't impress all of them. So, there's stuff to be learned, but I go back to what I said before. Immediately from these things without lots of conversations about the meaning of the data is just a mistake. You really have to contextualize it. What does it mean for Finland to do better than us? We need to talk about that. What does it mean for another country? What does it mean for looking at the relationship of poverty to outcomes cross-nationally and realize there are some other nations that have poverty issues the same as ours, but it doesn't look the same. What are we learning from that? What are the discussions we can have from that? So it's very important, I think, to keep fighting for data to improve our systems, whether it's a metric or a judgment or a panel. We need to keep fighting for resources to gather information and discuss what they mean. But I'm not sure there's one source of that would be better than any other.
I want to piggyback on that, and I think it's great in terms of information to know what's out there, how it's doing. I'm always fascinated by these articles that pop up on the computer and in my, social media feeds about the joyous 6-year-olds in Finland and what they're, the kindergartners, and I think about I see an article about the joyous illiterate kindergartners in India because these folks are outshining the U.S. So there's this kind of fetishization of what's happening in other places. And, I think it's interesting. It gets us past some of that American exceptionalism in this country about, the U.S. always being the best, to be told, no, actually, other people are doing things and it's working differently. And what Aaron said earlier, the link between culture and how that plays out in education. And even, I think some of the discussion, not as much to link with some of, I think, what David was saying this morning, teacher salaries, how teachers are treated, professionalization of teachers, how that looks different is starting to enter the conversation from the way that we perform on these, in the US, on these international measures. So I think it can be informational and useful to look at these. I think what gets tricky is when what's measured is the only thing that counts. And that is the reduction in the process that I think really limits the way that we're talking about schooling. And in a lot of the countries that outperform us, they haven't done that reductive, only focus on math and science and, you know, language arts. And that's why they perform better, is that it is a more holistic process. So I think that sort of the second step is what I would disagree with, but the first step of just having these metrics or just PISA, I think it can be very useful and instructive, and we learn things about other places and about other people, and oftentimes there are these linkages that can happen and these lessons that we can learn.
So I would say that other things being equal, usually they're not, but let's just say they are, that those more centralized education systems would be able to take away from PISA policy implications much more easily than a highly decentralized education system like the United States. So when you go to Japan, and I've spent time there some years ago, and you know that in the Ministry of Education in Japan, they've gone through all the items that the Japanese 8th grade students did on one of their PISA examinations, and identified precisely which issues the Japanese students did poorly, usually around critical thinking, and then challenged. In each prefecture in Japan, they have these kind of model schools in which they allow for experimentation, the development of kind of innovative lesson plans. This is where they began to challenge the teachers to come up with how do you develop critical thinking skills in 8th grade mathematics or in 8th grade science, because it's meant to permeate all the different subject areas. So that's an education system that can very easily take an analysis of PISA and find ways within their kind of policy reform and the way that they implement policy reform, find a way to actually have impact on the ground. But as we know, you know, the U.S. is 50 systems, and if you think about the district, the level, I mean, this is a highly decentralized polity and a highly decentralized education system. Most state governors or other state officials are not familiar with all the ins and outs of PISA, and you know, no matter how much we write about it and we think that our work matters, the fact of the matter is that many of the people that are making decisions about education reform in this country are fairly clueless about the results of the United States in a more detailed sense, beyond, you know, these kind of nasty league tables that would really be a basis for informing a much more nuanced set of reforms at the level of a subject or a syllabus or a grade level. So it's very difficult to see the connections between, let's say, PISA and, you know, kind of effective school reform here in the U.S.
I just want to add, when you bring up Japan all the time, not you, but when people bring up Japan all the time, we forget the Juku schools and what the Juku schools mean for test performance. I mean, if you have enough hours a day, that are like the ones on the test, you're likely to do better on the test. I don't think anyone disputes that. But the issue of the Juku schools raises the issue of the nature of childhood in each of our cultures. The U.S. sort of created childhood about 150 years ago, Western Europe did. We didn't have childhood until about 150 years ago. We actually like childhood. We like our kids to play. We like Friday night football in Texas. They're not studying anything useful, I think, in Texas on Friday nights. The point is we've created it, and the question is whether our version of childhood, which doesn't contain Juku schools or strong commitments to performance on tests, whether that commitment to childhood leads us to 30-year-olds who are creative and building an economy that's entrepreneurial and unique. I will argue that it probably does, and the GEDI, the Global Entrepreneurship Development Index, rates us not even number one, but number one by far. And so maybe we're making a mistake to worry about our country on the basis of the performance of 15-year-olds who are enjoying their childhood, starting to date. They don't give a damn about the tests or the curriculum. And that's a whole different, it doesn't get into the discourse of why nations differ. But the difference in childhood and the possible ramifications for adulthood, just need to be part of the thinking about performance.
So I'm going to invite you now to give your final remarks. And also as a small question there is, have you learned something new in this dialogue or something that you would like to consider and have another round of discussions?
Okay. Well, something definitely about sort of the interested more about what they could kind of do for this more holistic education for citizenship, for human rights. And so I think something new, and I'd like to pursue conversations around that. But for closing, I just say it's hard to be here discussions in the U.S. as someone who lives here. And it feels like it's a larger trend of kind of the election of very authoritarian leaders who advocating for limited rights for minority groups and oftentimes suggesting things that go against the principles of human rights and international, the UDHR. I'm thinking of places like the Philippines where people who are even suspected of drug use are being killed on the street. In India, the current leader, there was a channel that was broadcasting things that weren't favorable to the Prime Minister, President, that was shut down for 24 hours last week. We don't hear in this country because everything was about the elections. 25 governmental organizations, including human rights groups that I work with, their full registration status was just canceled, which means they can't receive any foreign funding. This is in India. So there's extreme crackdowns on sort of dissent, human rights that are happening. The vote, of course, and the hate crimes that spiked in the immediate aftermath of that. Similarly happening here in the U.S. yesterday. This is not what we talk about. There's kind of a spike in a girl to jump being pulled out and shooting, thrown to the ground. Middle schoolers chanting, build a wall. This kind of isolationism. I'm not looking at the districts, but I'm wondering where we as the education community really respond to talk about things that really matter. Issues of citizenship, of human rights, peace education. We see these global forces, and yet we don't necessarily talk about it in our work, about how we do need to do work that addresses these kinds of individualization and this kind of focus on the immediate instrumental economic impact of those forces on people as opposed to larger social values and this dismantling of the global.
Okay, I'll end there. Thanks.
Well, I'm a lot older than you and as depressed or worse than you about the state of the world and the state of my country, but the arc of history is positive, and we have to take a long view that things are going the right way if you have a 200-year vision. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. Usually I'm the depressive one. I just want to say thank you for inviting me to join your community. It's been a pleasure. I'll be here again tomorrow. I don't know if I added anything I was supposed to moderate, not to participate. But I have strong feelings, as you probably heard, about lots of things, and that's what comes of being an academic and being allowed to express them. So it's just a pleasure to be in another venue where we can talk and share ideas. So thanks for inviting me.
So this was meant to be a session that looked at the feasibility of global metrics and learning. I'm not sure that we've done as good of a job as we might have to address the theme of the session. I think an important distinction on the theme of this section is the technical feasibility of a global metric on the one hand and the political feasibility of a global metric on the other hand. And I think that we learned, interestingly, in the first session this morning that technically there's actually been a lot of progress, and certainly at some levels, for some subjects, for some skills, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch within the coming months and years to actually foresee a global metric that would evolve. I say that with the caveat of knowing that in China and India, the two biggest education systems in the world, they are about to embark on enormously visionary and ambitious national learning assessments, and how the extent to which they could be linked with any kind of global metric boggles the mind or remains to be seen. But I just kind of keep that in mind. But I do want to go back to the political feasibility. I think that although it wasn't something that was directly stated by people on this panel and in the morning, I think there are a lot of concerns by a lot of different people that there will be a kind of a growing opposition or tension or uneasiness, that the more we strive to develop a global metric, the greater will be the pushback at different levels for different reasons. And so, although technically it might be possible, politically I think it's going to be a huge and very contentious kind of a process. And so I think the issue then of national ownership and the extent to which such a metric can demonstrate its usability or impact in terms of actually improving things on the ground rather than just animating the conversations of donors and other those who allocate various resources, I think is enormously critical to address, as it were, the issue of political feasibility. And furthermore, in my view, because of the political issues that at least in the way I think of it, it gives greater credence for why we need to begin with and spend a lot of time trying to improve national capacities around a much broader set of learning outcomes to be assessed and to be used, and then think about, as an emergent property, the development of a broader metric only over time, perhaps over years.
With this, please join me in thanking the panelists. Jana is going to give us the directions for the rest of the evening.
I am so sorry about that audio feedback. I promise we will try and have that fixed for tomorrow. I'm sorry for the assault on your ears. So this afternoon we have a welcome reception for you. It begins at 5:30, so you have just a little bit of time to relax until then. And it's outside. It's by the Ring Fountain. So to get there, you're going to go out that door